Hey there everybody, and welcome back to another Blender tutorial where today we are doing the face hologram effect, which involves a lot. It involves tracking the face, making a hologram, putting that hologram on top of the face. There's going to be a lot in this tutorial, so get ready, buckle in, because we're going to be here for a while. One note that I'm going to make before we begin this adventure is when we're making the holograms, we're going to be using my S.H.I.T library, which again stands for Sci-Fi Hologram Interface Templates. So you can make your holograms yourself, or you can make it using my S.H.I.T, link in the description. Okay, let's begin. So starting off, we need to track the face so that we can put 3D elements on top of the face. To do this, I need footage of my face, which I already recorded. One thing you're going to notice in this footage, other than, wow, handsome man, you're going to notice that in this footage, I'm not actually deforming the face. I'm not opening and closing my eyes and mouth and all this. It's kind of like a static object that I'm just rotating. This makes the tracking infinitely easier. So make sure you do this with your footage, or if you're using my footage from the Patreon, that's why I did that. Before we begin tracking, set scene frames is going to make sure that our project has the same endpoint as the number of frames, so in this case 106 frames. Prefetch is going to load it into memory, and then in the color management tab we are going to set it to standard so we can see how it was filmed. Beautiful. If you don't know how to track, it's very easy. You hold control and you click. That adds a tracker. Before we add these trackers though, I want to make sure they have the correct settings. So I want to normalize them. That makes it so that when they go into shadow or into light, it will still be able to track. And you're going to see in this footage, the shadows kind of move, especially on this cheek over here, right? So I want to make sure they're normalized. And second of all, and even more importantly, set this to previous frames. So it's going to track, always looking backwards one frame instead of looking at frame number 1 and then matching it in the future. Because on frame 100, it's going to look nothing like frame 1. So previous frame is just going to keep it updating. It's a bit flimsy, but it works for face tracking. So at this point, every tracker I'm adding has these new properties. So I'm just picking points of high contrast. As I always say, if you have acne, you're in an advantage because you have more points of high contrast, literally more points to track. So select some points on your face, Control T to track, Control L to lock, and take any of those trackers that didn't work and delete them. And just make sure none of these trackers are doing anything weird. A good way to check is you go to the graph editor, and this shows the X and Y data of your trackers. If any of them look wonky, you can take them and just delete them. So maybe this one looks a bit weird. You just want to make sure the X and Y data looks very bundled together, and you got to make sure you have at least 8 trackers, which I do. Beautiful. We're going to take this tracking data and solve the camera motion. Here you can see we have a solve error of 1 pixel, which is phenomenal for something like this. Normally, you want definitely under a pixel, under half a pixel of error. But when we're tracking just a single element, the face, that is much smaller than the frame, and we're not using any other data, a solve error of 1 is really good. So I'm going to also do focal length, still at 1.07, that's fine. So what we're doing is we're going to have a moving camera around a stationary object. I know the case is the opposite. We have a stationary camera, and I'm orbiting my head like you're seeing in this shot. But the opposite is much easier to handle, and a solve error of 1 pixel is fine. Okay. So in the 3D viewport, you can see none of this data has been brought in. To do that, set up tracking scene. Now our camera is moving around a non-existent object. If I enable motion tracking, you can see these dots, which correspond to the trackers. And you can see that our camera is orbiting this thing. If I put an object, like the cube, on these points, so I'm just kind of positioning them where our face should be on these motion tracking points, you're going to see that it looks like the cube is actually tracking onto our face. However, the XY plane, which is where we kind of put our objects, that is not actually tracking on very well because our points are floating over here in space instead of at the 3D cursor. To fix that, just select 3 trackers, hit floor, that's going to center it, and you could even select one of these to be the origin, and let's see what that looks like. There we go, that looks a lot better. We go to the 3D cursor, we don't need this anymore. The 3D cursor is going to let us orbit our camera with respect to the cursor. So I'm just going to reorient this and move it on the X and Y plane So it looks like this is a bit tilted, so I'm gonna, you tilted, bro? I'm gonna tilt it on the y-axis, move it a bit on the x-axis, and there we go. So now when we add an object on the 3D cursor, it should look like it's tracked on fairly well. Cool. By the way, this doesn't need to be perfect because we're going to have our hologram floating above the face. So it's going to look something like this. And it's going to be a little hard to tell if the track's good or bad because it's a foot in front of our face. But that is the face tracking. Again, any object that we add is going to be tracked onto here. So now we just need to make that object that we want to track onto there. So let's save this boy. I'm going to call this the monster tutorial. And then I'm going to add shit because I'm trying to sell my product, sci-fi hologram interface templates. Boom. Okay, part 2, and we're going to come back to this project, but I'm going to start a new one just for the hologram. At this part, we're going to be making our hologram using my asset library. Again, link to the Gumroad or the Blender Market or whatever in the description, but let me just show you how this works, how we're going to create a hologram. So in the asset browser, load the S.H.I.T library. You're going to see all these procedural assets that you can modify. So here's DNA, control the number of bands, the spin, whatever. Doesn't matter. Point being, we're going to make a hologram that is not 3-dimensional. It's going to be 2-dimensional. And I know a lot of these elements are 3D, like this is a 3D element, this is a 3D element, but we're going to render it from the top view. So it's going to be kind of projected on the XY plane. Why? Because it's eventually going to be a screen that I'm just looking at without any 3D elements. So I'm going to bake it down to a 2-dimensional thing. What I'm trying to say here is no matter what elements we add, you're going to notice some of them are on top of each other. It doesn't matter. We only care about this view. Okay? With that in mind, let's make our hologram. Starting off, I always like to use the hexagon template. And by the way, this is something that will look much better in Cycles, although it is Eevee and Cycles compatible. So here we have our, I'm going to center it. Here we have our hexagon. This is a procedural material that you can see does the flickering. Bit of an issue here. I want this to be a 16:9 thing, so I'm going to multiply it by 1.778 on the x-axis. That is what 16 divided by 9 is, literally the aspect ratio. You see when I do that, it stretches this pattern, whereas I want it to stay regular hexagons, non-stretched hexagons. And there's actually no parameter for that in here, because that's not a typical use case. So we can control the cars outside. I'm like a dog being like, oh, there's cars, I need to mention it. People care in this tutorial. No, they don't. We have controls for the number of hexagons, for the speed of animation, all that. But nothing for the stretching. So I'm actually going to go into the node network. And this is the power of the S.H.I.T library, despite the name. All of the nodes are in your control if you want them to be. So for the texture coordinates, here's what we have to do. I'm going to take them and multiply them, but not by 1 and 1, 1, 1, which means basically do nothing, but on the x-axis by 1.778. This is the correction term for the other thing. So you can see now we have regular hexagons despite that this was stretched. And another thing we can do is in the fall off shape, which basically says do you want the fall off to be a circle or a square. As you can see, you can control that. I'm going to make it a square, and we also want to stretch out our square, which can be done. Don't worry about this node network. You can read into it in your own time. All you have to do is multiply the x-axis by some value that looks roughly correct. Okay? Now I'm going to boost the number of hexagons to somewhere in the middle, something like that. We can also control the fade to be something that looks good, and I'm happy with that. Okay? You could go into the details a bit more, but basically we just have a plane that looks good. So I'm going to call this the monster hologram asset that we're going to render to the other project. Okay. Now that we have this background, I want there to be some panel elements. So I'm going to use my panel generator, which basically what it does is it creates a random panel per the seed, as you can see. So I'm just going to try to find a panel. This one actually looks pretty sweet. I'm going to find one panel that I want off to the side, and I'm also going to duplicate it And relative to the 3D cursor, I'm going to scale it by -1, so we have like a symmetrical thing going on here. I'm also going to add another panel in here, so we could have different panel assets. And this one should be one that looks relatively symmetric. So I'm just going to play with the settings until we get something that looks pretty good. So I just messed with the bevel. I'm going to move this over by, I don't know, by 0.1, and move this over by -0.1, and now we have 3 panels. This one's going to be the one in the center, the one I'm looking through, and these are going to be like stat screens, like my health, and I don't know. One thing I want to do for this is I don't want the hexagons to be appearing inside the panels, so we can literally take the knife tool, literally, and cut away the hexagons. So this is the power of shit. You can just cut away elements, and it's because it's all procedural. When we cut this out, nothing changes, like it still works. So I'm going to do the same thing over here, and I know what you're asking, don't you want something to be there? Yes, we're going to get rid of the hexagons and replace it with something different. So something like that. Get rid of the faces, and then finally knife tool here. So is this the cleanest thing? No, but we're baking it down to a 2D map anyways, so you're not going to see this detail. Okay, get rid of these 2 faces. There we go. So now we have these hexagons that are not appearing in the middle. What are we going to put in the middle? Let's put this grid element. The grid element is pretty simple. Whoops. Let's have it go individual or median point. And we can just put this slightly below. The grid element is basically just this grid that moves off to the side. I'm going to go into its properties. And you can see we have a bunch of properties here, like how fast does the grid move, etc. I'm going to make the grid move slower, so I'm going to look for speed, make it bigger. It's basically what are you dividing by, so the bigger the number, the slower it goes. And I'm also going to make it move vertically. So instead of moving on the x-axis, I'm going to have it move on the y-axis. So now it's moving downwards. Or you could have it be -0.5 and it's moving upwards. Up to you. I'm happy with that. And just like last time, we're going to take this grid element and cut away. We probably could have saved our selection from before, but it doesn't matter. I'm just going to cut away everything outside of this. So something like that. Save this polygon, invert the selection, delete faces, and then we can duplicate this element and literally flip it, again, from the 3D cursor, -1 scale. So there we go. Let's add one more grid in the middle. Oh, did it save our cutout selection? I want it to just be a plane, whatever. We could fix that. Or, we could have it link instead of append. Hold up, I'm not super in depth with the asset browser. Append. There we go. Now it's not going to do our cutout. We could try to just scale it down so it fits in here, and we might actually be able to get away with that without the knife tool. Something like that. It ain't perfect, but it looks pretty good. So these move vertically, and this one moves horizontally. I like the look of that. Let's just have it go much, much slower. So again, the speed, set it to 300. And there we go. By the way, this is all something we can customize kind of the strength of. So you could always be like, oh, I want it to be more transparent. So I'm going to mix it with a transparent BSDF. So we're just doing stuff on the fly here and kind of fading it off like that. And we can do the same thing for this other one. Or we could have it just use the other. Well, I guess we wanted to use this one over here because we have a different direction. So again, I'm going to mix shader with a transparent BSDF and control kind of the transparency of it. This way it's not as intense. And let's also do that with the hexagons, why not? So, and I think after this, we're done with our background and we can start adding interesting elements to this. Okay, transparent. And I want this to be pretty faded. And I'm not talking about cross-faded, and more hexagons. There we go. Okay, now let's make this thing look interesting. I'm getting a phone call. Stop calling me. Hopefully that didn't interrupt the audio. I'm going to be so pissed if that interrupted the audio. Okay, so it better not have interrupted the audio. We're 15 fucking minutes into this. Okay, we could cut my losses and start a new recording, but I'm not going to do that. No, I'm not going to do that. Okay, so now we want to add interesting assets. So I'm thinking that the center element, which I can't see without the overlay, the center element is going to be where I'm looking through. So it'd be cool if there were some like circles, kind of like viewfinders almost, that I'm looking inside. So to do that, I'm going to add some of our circular elements. So I'm going to add a circular dashed, make sure this is centered, and let's play with some of the settings. So I'm going to make it less thick. And I'm going to make the size bigger than 1, which is a cool little hack, which gives you something like that. And this is an element that automatically spins. I'm going to make a duplicate, make it smaller, bring the size down. So I'm just playing with the assets right now. And just play around with different sizes and spins. The more spin you do, the faster it's going to go. I think that looks pretty good. And then finally, I'm going to add a different circular element. This is kind of like the intense boy circular element. I'm going to bring down the resolution to something that's a little less intense, and we can change the radius. So this just looks like something I'm looking through. By the way, another cool trick is we have the shrinking text circle effect, which you can see. Let's put this on top. You can see it does this kind of energy thing. I don't know how to describe it. I had a trouble figuring out what to call it, actually. So let's see what this looks like in context. So we have this, and then, yeah, that looks pretty dope. I'm thinking we make it smaller, so it kind of fades in inside this view. Yeah, that looks dope. And, yeah, we could add a couple, like, tiny elements to this, like maybe some arrows that we scale down. But at this point, I'm just putting in like random assets. So we'll use these arrow assets, rotate them by 90. Again, it doesn't matter where it is in 3D space since we're just going to render it as a 2D layer. So I'm going to make these arrows be over here. I think it'd be cool if all of them had the same arrow effect. So I'm going to make some duplicates. Maybe we can make this one symmetrical, so I'm going to rotate it by 180 degrees and put it here. So it's kind of like the mirror image of the other. And there you go. Some other elements, some blinking stuff, whatever. Throw it in. You could make it look cool in your own time. Some of that. Some of this. What do they do? I don't know. Does it matter? No. So you can see this one has kind of like a radar ping vibe to it. So I'm going to put that here, just making it look like there's some complicated math going on, even though there's not. You know what would make this, by the way, different seed, what would make this look complicated is just a random number. What does it do? I don't know. Median point. So hard to scale this element. So this is going to be a number. I don't know what it means. But what we can do, let's save by the way, is we can take all of this and put it inside a square element. So I'm just trying to show off as many assets as possible, really. The design is something that takes some time and consideration. But I'm putting it all inside this dotted dashed line asset. That makes it look more contained and like it's there for a reason. Let's go for some big elements. Complex shader, sonar. Why not? There will be some sonar in here. Make sure it's above the grid layer so both can be seen. Throw that in right there. We have sonar. For the other one, let's use some of the complicated 3D assets, like a node sphere. Just put that in there. What does it mean? Doesn't matter. We're just trying to make a simple HUD. And again, you could go crazy here with the amount of elements and all this. I'll show you one more. And then we're going to render it out just so that, you know, this tutorial is in 20 minutes of HUD design. But let's go for the circuit grid. This is kind of like the circuit circle, but it's a grid. Bring down the res. bring down the width, bring up the height. I just want something to line the sides of these. Something like that. That looks complicated. Duplicate, bring it over there. Immediately, we have something cooler going on. Final asset, just because we have this miscellaneous, the corner asset is good for just kind of like highlighting the corners of the panels. So something like that. Take it, rotate it by 90 degrees, put it there. I think it just looks cool. Okay, so at this point, you can spend an eternity making your HUD, but let's say that we're happy with this. What you want to do is I'm going to render it over a black background. This is important because we want a black and white image for our transparency. And I'm going to put a camera above this. So the camera goes up here. And again, we want this to be purely a 2D effect, and you can see it has some perspective to it, which is cool if you want it. But what I want to do is, I'm making it 30 frames per second because that's like our footage. What I want to do is I want it to be a 2D compressed thing. So I'm going to set it to orthographic, and then we can zoom in here. And this is our HUD. Not the most complicated thing in the world, but I think it gets the point across. So what we need to do is now render this as an element that we can put over our other shot. So 30 frames per second. I remember it was 106 frames long. Save. Make sure that in color management that we have this set to standard, so it's a pure black and white image. And you could try rendering, I mean, I think almost all of this is compatible in Eevee. Minus, yeah, you need to make, yeah, there you go. You need it to be alpha hashed. It takes a bit longer to do it in Eevee. We could add more samples. But I think we may as well just render it in cycles. It'll be almost as fast. So I'm just going to do this quickly. 100 samples a piece. Denoising, set it to optics. Let's see what one frame looks like in terms of render speed. That ain't bad. That ain't bad. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this as a movie clip. You could do it as an image sequence. We're going to render this as a video. We're going to call it Hologram Monster Asset, and Control F12 to render an animation. I'm just going to fast forward this part where we render so that we can now overlay the asset. Okay, so I decided to only render the first 30 frames after this frame. I'm going to exit because I'm lazy, but 30 frames is enough to prove the point. You render the entire thing, it will show the entire thing. So we're going to take our first 30 frames. Let's open up our last one, which was it called the monster tutorial shit? What are we doing here? Either way, all we need to do is we need to add in a plane object, solid view so we can see it. You want to pick a height so it's hovering above the face. We'll control the size later. And in the shading workspace, so now we're putting our hologram on top of the footage is the idea. We're going to make a material. We're going to call it Hollow Shit, me every day. And all we need to do is bring in our movie clip. So use an image texture node and bring in, what did we call this thing? I cannot for the life of me remember. Hologram Monster Asset. There we go. So here you can see, by the way, we need to make sure this thing, right now it's not animated. Make sure you have both these checkboxes, set it to 30 frames since that's how many we rendered. So it's just going to be a looping 30 frame animation. Again, render out all 106 frames. We have this, remember we rendered it as a 16:9, so scale it up by 1.778 on the x-axis. And let's see what this looks like. Using the rendered view and with film set to transparent so we can actually see this on top of our footage. There we go. To actually see this thing with our face beneath it, let's send this through a transparent BSDF so we can mix shader. This could be our factor. Transparent BSDF on the bottom. On the top, we should have some color. And this is where you can start picking your color. I'm going to have it set to white. Does it like cycles better? It does. We're going to have this set to cycles, camera. I know I'm going all over the place, but I'm just trying to wrap it up, you know. I want to make sure that we can actually see our background, so I'm going to make this full brightness. HUD should be bigger. And there you go. So you can see these hexagons are kind of light, which I like the look of. If you want to control this a bit more, you could send this through a multiplication. So the more we multiply, the brighter this is going to be. So maybe let's multiply it by 2. And a couple things. First of all, we're looking at this kind of inverted because you can see the number is read correctly here. If this is a hologram, it's made so that I can see it, right? So this number is inverted from my perspective. So we got to scale it by -1, so it's flipped. And also, let's just do this. I'm going to add a couple loop cuts. And I'm going to select kind of the center face. Make sure we have proportional editing on, set to sphere. This is a way that we could actually bend the display since it's all using UV coordinates. So something like that. Bring it back down. And now we have a nice curved display. Wowee! So let's pick a frame and now do a bit of compositing. So by the way, since this is a 2D asset, we can now enable motion blur without any worries. So I'm going to render one frame. By the way, I'm just going to get rid of all this background stuff that came from the the setup tracking scene. Let's just render a frame, see what it looks like. Oh, it's doing 4,096 samples. Get out of here. 200 samples with denoising. Take it or leave it. So we're going to render one frame. It's going to render super fast because it's a 2D element. And you can see some of this compositing is already done for us with this render layers situation. I'm just going to delete a lot of this. Again, this comes from the setup tracking scene. I'm just going to get rid of that and that. So that all we have is the footage and our render layer. And this is where we make the magic happen. Because right now, I agree, it looks like trash. We need to make it look better. So the first thing I want to do is I want to be able to control the color of this. So I'm going to mix this with a multiplication. So let's view this only. If you multiply by a color, since this is white, like blue, it's going to dye the whole thing that color. So you can see now we have this color HUD. But again, it looks like trash. We got to make it look better. The secret to making a good looking HUD is actually in the blur. I'm going to use a glare and a blur. So starting off with the glare, let's see, does this add any glare already? It does not, so we got to bring down the threshold. There we go. So now you can see we're getting some glare. So this is before, after. The lower the threshold, you're basically saying more of this image is eligible to be blown up. We're going to take that, run it through the color. So now it looks a bit doper. Let's bring down the saturation so it's a little less intense. That already looks amazing. Another great trick, and I think this is what really sets it apart, is you want to add a directional blur. Directional blur, the way it works is you pick a direction. So I'm going to go 90 degrees, so it's kind of going vertically. You increase the number of iterations so it looks smooth. And at this point, you can like scale it up by a certain thing. Either way, what we do is we take this, we're going to add it over our other thing. So here's what it looks like. It's going to look a bit messy. By the way, let's do it to the other side. So basically what we have is we have our original image with a bit of glare. And then we add this directional blur. And this is what's going to make it look super sci-fi. And then we dye it. And then we send it through the image. Yeah, that's already looking sick. Other things we can do is we could throw it through lens distortion, chromatic aberration, stuff like that. Why not? Let's distort this boy with a bit of... Do we need to do this beforehand? I guess we could do this as a final thing, just as a overall thing. Lens distortion, throw it in there, make it 0.1. Is that extreme? I mean, it is extreme, but it looks sick, so I'm taking it. We're going to add some lens distortion. I'm also going to add more of the directional blur. And again, if you add too much of it, it's going to look like insane, but it does kind of look more hologrammy. And we could add a bit of zoom to this as well. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, that's nice and hologrammy. Basically, the quality of this effect depends on how much work you're putting in. But I think another thing we can do that's really going to sell this effect is if we have it distort the footage, like it's almost hot and creates these heat waves, that's going to be huge. So that's another compositing trick. So we're going to use a displace on the footage. What displace does is the more displacement you have, it sets it off to the side. But we can set it to displace relative to our render. So I'm having the XY scale affect it, and you're not going to see it yet because it's not strong enough. Take it, multiply it by a big number like 50, and now you can see we have this nice distortion. In fact, if we blur this before it even gets there, so we blur it by 10, it's going to have kind of a more soft distortion. And I know it looks crazy, like, I know, but then you put the hologram over it, it's going to hide those areas, but it's still going to have a bit of distortion poking out. So here's before and after. You can kind of tell it's distorting. So do that, and that already looks sick. Final detail for the hologram is you could run it through some kind of shadow or a softness filter. Shadow makes it look like it's embedded in the image. I just like to add a bit of shadow. So here's before and after. It just adds a bit of something. And that's generally how you do the compositing. So let's go to a different frame where it's facing me. Render that out. It's going to do all the compositing tricks, and there you go. Again, if you want this to be, I guess we could also make it a bit transparent. So let's see. Yeah, this is how much the HUD is there. Maybe we'll make it like 70% there. That already helps a lot. You can also, again, control the strength of this hologram by multiplying it here. So like, for example, now you can see it's crazy. If I multiply it by like 2, you can see the hologram is much more intense. That's just a thing. But that's how you do the compositing, is what I'm trying to say. Maybe we'll make it 20% stronger and clamp. Okay, I think that's the essence of the tutorial. I know it was a shit show, but you lived. You made it through the 30-minute thing. So at this point, I just want to say, normally I promote my Patreon, but I'm just going to say, if you are interested in making custom holograms, consider getting the shit library. I need to end this tutorial fast. I'm crashing and burning. Consider getting the shit what is on my hand? Speaking of shit, consider getting the shit library. It's on Gumroad. That's it. Okay, see ya.